The Bribery Act 2010 became law on the 1st of July 2011. This is the most radical change to our bribery laws, probably for all time, but certainly for 105 years. This act sweeps away all the old law. It sweeps away all the old statute law, all the old common law, and very significantly, in reforming the law, it makes no distinction between public corruption on the one hand and private corruption on the other. So, just to be clear, there's no distinction except for one discrete offence that we'll come to in a moment between bribing a public official here or overseas and the bribery, commercial business-to-business bribery, bribing a buyer of a retail outfit, for example. So the elements of bribery are the same. The structure of the Act is to create 4 separate main offences. First offence in Section 1 of the Act is the giving of a bribe, and it describes how the offence is committed. I should say that in this section, and in no part of this Act, does the legislation use the word corruption or corrupt. It describes the conduct, but it doesn't go down this blind alley of describing what is or is not corruption, using that phrase, because it's mindful of what went before. The judges, you remember, defined corruption as conduct which tends to corrupt, which itself wasn't the most helpful or uncircular definition. So, Section 1, the active offence, bribing. Section 2, the passive offence, receiving a bribe, or being the recipient of the conduct meant to influence you. And then sections, we'll see in a moment, sections 3, 4, and 5, they explain the sort of conduct that will be caught by sections 1 and 2, the sorts of people who will be caught, the sorts of occupations that will be caught. And then we come to section 6. Section 6 is the section which puts it beyond all doubt that we are compliant with the 1997 OECD Convention outlawing the bribery of foreign public officials. It sets out what the conduct is. It defines public officials subsequently, and it says what conduct shall constitute a bribe. I'll come back to that later. And then lastly, we come to section 7. This is the offence of a business organisation failing to prevent bribery. A very unusual offence because it's structured like a regulatory offence. It starts with the idea that a business organisation has benefited from bribery committed somewhere here or overseas on its behalf. And the offence says, well, that's the offence. If somebody associated with you as a business organisation has bribed on your behalf, you're guilty as a business organisation of the offence. Unless you can demonstrate up to what's called a civil standard of proof, a balance of probabilities, that you had procedures in place which were adequate to prevent it, but failed to prevent it because the law recognises that nothing is 100% foolproof. So that's section 7. The Act then goes on to discuss how adequate procedures are going to be judged. Because when the Act was going through Parliament, a bipartisan measure, the then Conservative opposition wrung from the government of the day, the new Labour government, a promise that they would introduce some kind of guidance for the use of business so that businesses were not left in any doubt as to what were or were not adequate procedures. There were particular worries, of course, about corporate hospitality, about promotional expense, the sorts of things that businesses do worry about, and, of course, the issue that later on proved so troublesome, facilitation payments, the small payments, grease payments, the Americans call them, small payments made to foreign public officials for doing nothing more than their job, but putting you at the top of the list, stopping your tomatoes rotting on the dock while they clear somebody else's goods, and so on, small payments. That also was going to be dealt with, and was dealt with, of course, in the guidance published by the Ministry of Justice. They should say at this stage that one cannot understand this Act, and one certainly can't appreciate the Act without looking at this guidance, not only the Ministry of Justice guidance, but also the guidance put out on behalf of prosecution agencies by the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Director of the Serious Fraud Office. And they have published guidance which changes the way they will consider complaints of bribery, how they will distinguish between those cases where they believe there's evidence and there's no evidence, but also, most importantly, how will they distinguish between those cases where they believe it's in the public interest to prosecute and those where they do not believe it's in the public interest to prosecute. And if you remember, at the time that the guidance was being considered and later on when the guidance was published, there was a lot of controversy with the campaigning groups wanting tough rules and business saying, you must allow business to do business and don't please take away our competitive edge. For the rest of the Act, there are other important features to this Act. Remember, it's very extraterritorial, so look through it to make sure that the UK agency does have a reach overseas. Remember that in the guidance, there was some indication that simply a company simply with a stock exchange listing in London, but no other connection to the UK, would not be liable to prosecution. And lastly, the armed forces and the security services have a large degree of immunity under this Act. The Act, lastly, I want to say, increases the penalties for bribery from 7 years to 10 years for individuals, 7 years, 10 years imprisonment. And remember, fines for corporations and business organizations, if they are the nature of corporations, are unlimited.